dear parents, these things can happen and you have to own the responsibility. You cannot delegate the responsibility to the state.
I'm becoming really emotional when we talk about this. I have no words, I'm speechless.
It's
maybe.
unconscionable.
Yeah.
The preservation of our freedom is everyone's concern.
In Headwind, journalists Jacobine Hausman and Alain Groutars interview people who found themselves in the eye of the storm.
When I wake up in the morning.
In this episode of Headwind, Jacobine Hausman and Alain Groutars have a roundtable discussion with Dr. Robert Malone and Dr. Geert Vanden Bossche on the corona crisis and the mandates.
Welcome, Dr. Geert Vanden Bossche and Dr. Robert Malone.
Thank you.
Welcome to Spain. Have you met in person before, or is this the first time you're actually seeing each other live?
Well, at least that I remember, we have been working together at Solvay a number of years ago, but we have been discussing, did we really see each other or didn't we see each other? We knew about each other, of course, but I cannot remember having seen Robert live as I do right now.
I think they brought me, because I was working for Solvay in Marietta, Georgia, down by Atlanta, and for Solvay for their American division. And they brought me into WASP, and I think I might have met him in that brief tour where they trotted me around and introduced me to everybody. But it's so long ago, it's funny how these things pass.
Yeah.
But I was very aware of him. He was one of the great virology minds at Solvay when they were building out their new capabilities for cell-based influenza vaccine development and manufacturing. So there was some really strong virologists and vaccinologists at Solvay back then.
You were often, Robert, a speaker at congresses. I think you told me that you saw him at a few congresses.
Yeah, I've seen Robert a number of times at congresses, but for some reason we didn't really have the opportunity to interact, because you were often a moderator, right, at congresses.
Often, yeah.
Yeah. So he always occupied a kind of central position, and I guess I just didn't have an opportunity because he was so occupied.
That central position that never changed.
Yeah.
Do you remember when you both respectively hit the arena during the pandemic? When did you come forward?
When I became aware that the purpose was to do mass vaccination, I did my homework for at least 6 weeks, took a really deep dive in to make sure that I was, from the very beginning, I thought this is not a good idea, but then I wanted to bring all the scientific arguments together. And I had started actually to write an article that I would submit to, for peer review. But then I realized that things were going so fast, and that peer review, normally now it all goes faster, it's expedited, but that it would take several months, and that would not be a good idea. So I immediately took action, did my homework, was pretty certain that what I was saying would make a lot of sense, and called on the WHO at least to open a debate on this.
Yeah, did you reach out to colleagues as well? Did you, for instance, reach out to Robert on this?
I reached out, as I had been doing before with the Ebola vaccine. So I knew how these things work. This was not the first time I was doing this. I reached out to all regulatory agencies. Well, not all of them, but EMEA, also of course the FDA. And then the key global health authorities, like of course the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Gavi. I also reached out to Bill Gates himself. I copied a number of vaccinologists to this call. Also to NIH, for example, CDC. So I had my list of usual suspects who are supposed, to become aware of, this type of crisis and the type of reaction that some experts would have to
Did you get a
their
response?
initiatives. No. You don't get a response to this. That I knew from the very beginning. I got one response from somebody I copied, a very well-renowned vaccinologist that I know personally, and this person knows me. I'm not going to unveil the name, and who literally responded to me and said, Geert, you're right. These vaccines are only going to breed variants, but nobody's going to listen to you because you go against mainstream.
The whole idea of Operation Warp Speed and accelerating the vaccine development, remember I did a threat assessment in the beginning of January 2020. The timeline for vaccine development for a safe and effective vaccine was such that we would lose there would be significant unnecessary death as opposed to the timeline for developing repurposed drugs. Like you, I did send, as we moved through our computational analysis, I did send to Bill and Melinda Gates as well as the U.S. government our findings. I never got a response from Bill and Melinda Gates, as I think is almost to be expected. It's a fruitless thing. They have their experts and they don't really want to listen to anybody else. And then as time progressed, I had this very interactive discussion with 3 senior people at the FDA that was kind of ongoing, where we would talk about repurposed drugs and the latest news and what was going on with the vaccines and and then as the vaccines began to roll out, talking about the vaccine injuries kind of in the fall and the clinical trial data as it was coming out, what was going on there. It's been a ratcheting up of alarm and awareness as I've observed things and I've observed the governmental response and the WHO response. I have to say, based on the prior outbreaks, my opinion of the WHO is not very high as my base set point, based on prior experience, including the Ebola outbreak. But they have consistently been underwhelming. The team, in my mind, the team that was managing that was inexperienced, was making statements that were just not consistent with the data as I saw it, and making public policy, setting public policy that to me just seemed dysfunctional. It's just been a unflowering of awareness that things that are being done are just not right, that it was difficult to account for the public policy actions that were being taken if they were solely driven by more traditional public health concerns.
Geert, what was your opinion on the outbreak management of the WHO?
People like it or dislike it, but I consider this organization to be, as Robert was already saying, dysfunctional, incompetent, which doesn't mean that the people are incompetent. For example, the fact that there was really an emergency for a debate on this, I think this was not a gray zone. For me, this was a very clear need. So, I mean, my summary on this is that this organization, and again, I've experienced their attitude and behavior during the Ebola crisis. Based on that bad experience, the WHO, to a large extent, got even reorganized, and then you got also additional bodies again generated, like CEPI, etc. And it all adds to the complexity. And it's always my opinion that the more things are complex and the more people report to one another and you create these dependencies, etc., the less time you have, because this also takes a lot of time. All this bureaucracy, all these
middle
meetings,
management.
Exactly. And here we were really facing a completely new challenge, also scientifically, I would say, very challenging. And then I'm thinking, my God, who is really doing the homework here? Who is taking the deep dive in the science? And it's very clear that these organizations are not doing this. And in contrast, I always had the impression that the WHO is in fact running behind things.
Yes. Yeah, this is crucial what you just said. That the World Health Organization and public health in general tends to be reactive, not proactive.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I think this is one of the fundamental flaws as we look forward to what could we do better next time.
Yeah.
is this because as with you, I've dealt with the WHO through too many outbreaks and the CDC, et cetera. And it's always in a reactive stance based on what they consider to be well-established data. But during an outbreak, the data are moving so fast, the stream of information is so fast, and the situation is changing so rapidly, it's so dynamic, that if you're in a position where you're only going to set policy based on what you consider to be well-established data, and of course the most extreme version of that is you only react based on peer-reviewed published data. Well, that's 6 to 9 months out of date, right? And so you're always in this reactive stance, and you make the officials make a policy decision or pronouncement, and it's immediately those like you and I that are working more at the forefront of the data. It's immediately apparent that those policies are already out of date and they're dysfunctional. And it's also clear increasingly to the general public as they become more educated, as they've all obsessed over this.
So, Robert, how would you reorganize the WHO if it was up to you?
The WHO is compromised in a number of ways, as Gert was just saying. And I'd learned about this through influenza and Ebola and Zika in particular. One of the things that's not generally understood is that the WHO, and it was exacerbated by Trump's decision, the WHO has lost a lot of its funding. So when you go to the building, there's a lot of empty offices, generally speaking. It was once larger, stronger, better funded. What they have resorted to is soliciting capital from the pharmaceutical industry. So when we were when I was supporting the company Newlink, which held the patent for the Canadian vaccine that we sold off to Merck, and that became the Merck Ebola vaccine. When we were presenting our data at the WHO, it was an odd situation because we were underdogs. And we only had the U.S. Department of Defense behind us, which was an odd situation. But when it became clear that the GSK product, adeno-vectored product, was not manufactured or manufacturable, and suddenly the product that the Canadian government had originally developed, Public Health Agency Canada, this VSV recombinant vaccine product, became one of the leading candidates, the Director General of the WHO came up to my client and solicited funding from them and said, well, you should be like these other big pharma, and you should be making major donations to the WHO. The other thing that I had been aware of was a colleague of mine that I used to interact with quite a bit that was an expert in drugs and drug repurposing at WHO. He was working there funded by a infectious disease research institute based in Seattle. So he was functionally there performing work for the WHO and had an appointment from the WHO, but the money for his appointment was coming from an outside company, and he was effectively functioning as an agent of that company, buried within the bureaucracy and reporting back to the company. Yeah. So there's all of these intrinsic conflicts, and then we had Trump pull out, which was a dysfunctional decision, and left in the breach. As I understand it, the People's Republic of China stepped in. In terms of Trump's global agenda, it was madness. But that then very effectively, already the WHO had been increasingly skewed by its funding sources, and then there's the whole thing in the WHO. It wants so badly to be inclusive. It's a UN agency. And so in its effort to be inclusive of all cultures from all places, and kind of taking a stance that all nations are equal, in a sense, politically, so they all have voices, which is a noble cause, you end up with a situation where there are nation states that are not well versed in regulatory affairs and infectious disease, but having a very large influence on the decision making and so the whole system has just become increasingly complex, increasingly dysfunctional, and it seems like with every outbreak that gets compounded. Is that fair, you think, Gerd?
And another thing, you say all nations are equal, including Bill Gates, because what's
well,
like
there's
13%?
There's that. Okay, yeah. So then
his hands.
well said. So now we're in the breach of inadequate public funding from nation states of the World Health Organization. We've had this gentleman who is a software magnate whose primary skill seems to be in developing monopolies. I mean, that's his core competency is monopolistic behavior, has moved in and decided that he would, I mean, with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, this was a strategic pivot to improve his reputation after he had lost court battles relating to monopolistic practices having to do with the Microsoft Explorer browser, remember?
Yeah.
And so this was a way to rehabilitate himself. He was going to do good works, but it's almost as if he can't resist the urge to be a monopolist and to dominate things with his money. And he came in and he's definitely dominated and distorted world health.
You worked with him and you talked with him, you sat with him in private, so you know him a bit. You think he's like, he tries to do good work, no? You believe that?
Well, people can always change, of course, their behavior, their attitude, that's possible. So I can only tell you, what I experienced in the brief contacts that I had with Bill Gates. And of course, there's no doubt that this is a very ambitious man, very clearly, and that he takes pride in getting things done. But I always admired, I must say, the deep dive that he took in matters that he had never ever been confronted with before, that he had never ever been studied before. I know that Bill Gates was taking a deep dive in immunology, microbiology, all these type of things. We had regular meetings with his advisory committee on how, for example, vaccines are manufactured, how vaccines are designed, and he really wanted to know about the nitty-gritty of these things. It was not like, give me a broad overview. He took a deep dive. Before we had this meetings, for example, each of us, we got like a dossier of almost 1,000 pages of all kinds of publications that we were digesting, analyzing in order to present this for Bill Gates. He himself was reading all this stuff. So he really wanted to understand things. Of course, then he's a strong believer in vaccines, as we are, right? Because why? Because, of course, with vaccines, you can have, if the vaccines work, of course, and if they are appropriately used, and you can have a global impact. And of course, the focus is on third world countries, etc., and the world globally. And of course, I had the unique opportunity to meet with Bill Gates himself in private on, an idea that I had about developing an HIV vaccine that he took very, very seriously, etc. This is somebody who wants to translate knowledge into products. That's what he has been doing. Microsoft, of course, as well.
There is a tension between noble objectives and a desire to do good, and the practical reality of doing so in the environment in which there are so many commercial stakes, so much profit involved, and so many different agendas that are pursuing that profit and those business opportunities. And I must say, I'm compelled by a videotape of Bill Gates at Whistler, some ski resort, where he was really quite proud of the investments that he had personally made in his portfolio, stock investments, equity investments in key vaccine companies like Moderna and Pfizer and BioNTech, and what an enormous return on investment those actions had produced. It wasn't, the language was not around doing good. It was around, making profit from this industry and from this outbreak, whatever his intentions. You have an individual with a bias towards one solution, that being a vaccine solution, almost to the exclusion of all others, that exerts such a huge influence on decision making that the phrase of Animal Farm comes to mind. All pigs are created equal, but some are more equal than others. And Bill Gates is clearly more equal than others in voices, and he is not an expert, and he clearly has a bias. And it's been well documented that he has distorted public health globally and continues to do so.
You're one of the few dissident voices in Europe.
We are one team, regardless of the country, etc. So I don't feel like I'm just operating alone. I think I've worked in several different countries. I think the business we are in is a global business anyway. So it doesn't worry me whether Robert is in the US or anybody else or in another country. We are fighting for the same goal, and we are just going for the truth, and that unifies us regardless of borders. Or it doesn't. My country doesn't play any role in my attitude to the whole thing.
Robert, you seem to me, if I read you well, you've been more a Democrat than a Republican, but now you've been moved into the other side.
Or framed, more or less.
Yeah, I would say more that there's a major political realignment going on in the United States that is triggered by the policies and by a surprising overreach, political overreach that caught a lot of people by surprise, I think. The statements made during the election by the Biden camp was that they would not do mandates. They would not implement many of these egregious measures. And there's many clips of them expressing great skepticism about these rushed vaccines, including Biden himself. And then with the transition to where they felt, I guess, I'm trying to give them the benefit of the doubt, that administration, the burden of responsibility for American health, there was this gradual progression to more and more authoritarian positions. And this seems to be part of a broader trend within that administration and their supporters that is very paradoxical, that they're comfortable with assuming a more authoritarian stance. But in terms of the dichotomy of the two-party system in the United States, I think one of the things that this reveals in a bigger, more global sense is the power of the bureaucracy in the United States. This is the case in European nations too. I'm reminded of the old BBC series Yes Minister, that makes fun out of the truth the underlying truth that it's the bureaucrats that often guide policy. But watching the transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, it seems like it's best seen as a continuous progression of policy towards a more authoritarian diktat, perhaps out of frustration or fear. Giving the benefit of the doubt. Maybe it's the fear that's driving these behaviors, but whatever it is, or it's the mass formation that we'll discuss later, but this great insight of Matthias Desmet. But I think that this imagining the United States as a binary system is an oversimplification, because you have this enduring, deeply rooted bureaucracy that is, pejoratively called the deep state, but reaches into the intelligence community that's very entrenched and has been for decades. And that the behaviors, again, I think it's important to watch not the words but the actions And I'm reminded, as we were talking a moment ago about Bill Gates, you know, the best laid plans often go awry, and the road to hell is paved with good intentions. As you look at the transition from Trump to Biden, you have these central players like Collins and Fauci, and much of the underlying bureaucracy at CDC and NIH persists across administration after administration after administration. And they clearly defend their interests as individuals within this bureaucracy, sometimes at the expense of the public health.
Ready?
Yeah. Some people think that Geert's theory is quite controversial. But have you followed Geert, and what do you think of his theory? Do you completely agree with him?
Pretty close. I would say more that I strive to learn from him. You talk about, are we always on the same page? If we were, we wouldn't be scientists. We would be something else. Maybe politicians, or maybe we would be in the mass. But we wouldn't be scientists. I think we must have dynamic tension with each other and with ourselves to have integrity. I had given a couple of podcasts where I had spoken about what's often the progression of a pathogen when it enters a new host. And that often these outbreaks and this high pathogenicity is associated with transition from species to species, because the pathogen naturally over time becomes acclimated to the host. You know, the nature of parasitic relationships is to move towards a more benign, moving towards a partnership and away from a highly pathogenic relationship. And the Ebola virus is a great example of that. You know, up until recently, it kept moving out of bat populations largely because of disturbance of ecological niches, and sporadically popping up and crossing over into human populations. And it was so pathogenic that it would burn through those populations in local villages and not be propagated to surrounding villages. And so I had spoken in a couple of podcasts about looking forward, what I thought was the logical progression of this virus, that over time it would become more infectious, more prevalent in the population, probably endemic, and probably become less pathogenic because it's not in the interest of the host, of the virus or the pathogen.
To kill the host.
To kill the host.
Yeah.
On a short term, we want the host, the pathogen ecologically, not because it's so conscious, would evolve to a point where it would have a more benign relationship with the host, so that the host is moving around in society, in the environment, and the pathogen is more easily transmitted to other people, other individuals in the environment. Someone brought up to me that Geert was speaking, the issue of the potential, with some veterinary examples of Merrick's disease, that vaccinating into an ongoing epidemic was a different thing, and risked the creation not only of resistant mutants, of course, that's natural, one would expect that evolutionarily, but also would create risk of evolution of more pathogenic variants. And so I was really intrigued to learn more about Geert and his theories. And then he went even deeper, speaking about natural immunity, and appropriately criticized that natural immunity is not something that is traditionally taught in medical practice and medical textbooks. My relationship to his ideas are more those of a student wanting to learn rather than a dynamic conflict.
Yeah.
The antibody-dependent enhancement thread that you mentioned, so this term, I was criticized strongly early on in the outbreak, even though the FDA has used this term, and it was the term that was applied for prior coronavirus vaccine development. But it is actually Gert's discipline that gets the credit for the only prior successes in veterinary vaccine. It was the veterinarians that developed effective coronavirus vaccines, whereas the medical scientific world that's more focused on human health, I'm always jealous of my veterinary colleagues because they can do challenges, which we really can't do in most cases ethically. So they can do more rigorous science. In the nuance of the antibody-dependent enhancement, I was reprimanded, even though the FDA had been using this terminology and it had been in the literature to explain the let's call it vaccine-enhanced replication or disease is the broader category. And I was reprimanded because there's a lot of nuance. There are those that are lumpers and those that are splitters in everything. And so there was an insistence among some vaccinologists that antibody-dependent enhancement was more appropriately applied when one observed replication in monocytes, white blood cells of certain types. And so since this virus could not be clearly demonstrated to replicate in macrophage or other antigen-presenting cells, dendritic cells, then it wasn't appropriate to use this term antibody-dependent enhancement.
When you have massive immune pressure, the virus will evolve. I mean, of course, you have all these variants that have been identified before, but that is, for me, that is irrelevant. What is relevant is why does one or the other variant become more dominant in the population, and what characterizes this a competitive advantage. For example, we know that all these variants that we are seeing are more infectious, or becoming highly infectious. And so that is one thing that you don't have, of course, in a clinical study, because it's well defined, it's a subset of a population. Because what we also see is that if you start to have high infectious pressure and high infection rate, this has also repercussion on the immune reaction of the population. It just highlights the importance of the interplay between the virus and the immune system. Here we don't talk a lot about the training of the innate immune system. This is knowledge that has been published, I would say, about 5 years ago, how through epigenetic changes, for example, the innate immune system can be trained, become very, very powerful. I'm trying to explain those things, and this is to some extent based on hypothesis, of course, but I try to base this hypothesis on sound concepts that are known in science. Somebody advances a certain hypothesis based on sound concepts, and then it can be challenged, and that is how we start to fine-tune and ultimately come closer and closer to what is probably the right insight.
If we go back to the virus, what we see now with Omicron, for instance, is the big disappearing act of Delta. Last year we saw the big disappearing act of the flu.
We're their territory. We're their food. We're their niche. And they're competing for that niche. And they're competing even though they're in theory the same species. They're variants of those species, and those that are more adapted for that niche will outcompete the others. I mean, it's as simple as that. You want to elaborate, Gert?
What is the competition about? If you are exerting huge immune pressure, then it's about overcoming this immune pressure. It could be another obstacle. You could, for example...
Transmissibility could be.
Yeah, transmissibility could also be, for example, in the lab, you can culture these viruses in under unfavorable temperatures, for example. And then some of the viruses, let's say you grow these viruses on cell cultures at 37 degrees, and then you say, well, let's try 37.5 or 38 degrees. Yeah. Of course, the virus doesn't feel very fit under these circumstances. This is an obstacle to the virus replication. But some mutants, they will happen you know, to resist this higher temperature. And then you do a passage under the same condition, and so you can enrich the mutants that are capable to overcome this unfavorable condition. In this situation, it's very obviously the immune pressure that we are putting massively by doing this mass vaccination on the virus that will select viruses that can overcome this by being more infectious, right? And that is something very consistent that we are seeing, that in this whole evolution, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, omicron, etc., we, you know, the level of infectiousness.
The use of masks, social distancing, each one of these things that we're trying to do to adapt to this pathogen will create a new environment that will create a new selective pressure. So that's just a fundamental until we reach some sort of an equilibrium with this virus. And any of these things will functionally delay the development of that equilibrium. That could be adaptive. If we were to reach towards that equilibrium too quickly, it would overwhelm our hospitals, and then the mortality rate goes through the roof, right? So it's like that would be a informed public policy, would be one that would be guided by these fundamental principles of the dynamic tension between a population and its behavior and a pathogen, right? Because we can't, I think the start of this whole thing that was most naive was this logic that we could beat this virus, that we could eliminate it, when we rapidly knew that it had moved into animal populations, and it was grossly naive, this idea. This concept of R0, the replication coefficient in the absence of any modification of behavior. So vaccines, social distancing, mask use, kind of the innate reproductive coefficient of the virus. If I'm infected at the beginning, on average, if I represent the population, I would have infected 2 or 3 other individuals. So we had an R0 in the range of 2 to pushing 3. With Delta, we had an R0 that was kind of in the 4 to 5 range. So if I'm infected with Delta, on average, I'll infect 4 or 5 others. And now with Omicron, we're at something that is as infectious as measles. It's coming in kind of in the 7 to 10 range, which is incredibly infectious, and so infectious that this whole logic of mask use or any of those kinds of things, even with Delta, the CDC was aware that even if they had 100% vaccination with these leaky vaccines and perfect mask use, the most they could do is slow down the transmissibility of Delta.
So it's not like the virus has a brain and says, well, I've done enough harm and enough damage, and now I'm going to calm down a little bit. Why is this? I mean, it is because the population is mounting more and more immunity. Remember, that is how ultimately, after a natural pandemic, we come even to the point where we reach herd immunity, where the immunity is so strong, where the population keeps the virus to a large extent under control, to an extent such that the likelihood of those who have not this immunity or vulnerable people to get infected becomes so low that, in fact, these people are protected. What I'm interested in is, where is this thing going? The end station, through human intervention now, the mass vaccination, we are driving these strains all to the same kind of end station. And that is what we need to know, because otherwise we cannot anticipate, otherwise we cannot identify the shortcomings in our strategies. And well, it's not even a strategy, it's a tactic, right? Because the overall objective, generating herd immunity, I mean, is gone. So what are these guys doing? If you don't get herd immunity, you cannot tame a pandemic. If you have no substantial impact on transmission, which the vaccines very clearly don't have, you cannot tame a pandemic.
3 little nuances, not disagreements, but slight variations. I'm perplexed by the poor durability of the vaccines. What that translates to, we normally, as Gert very nicely illustrates in some of his podcasts, when we say, oh no, the antibody titers are falling after n number of weeks, that's kind of a false metric. Because if we didn't have that quenching of the antibody in our bodies, we would basically, our entire circulatory system would collapse. It would sludge. We would have so much protein in it. So this is a normal process that these things decay. What we should be focusing on, as Gert is correctly saying, is we're not really doing the immunology that we need to do. We should be focusing on the memory cell populations. Why aren't we focusing on the memory cell populations that give rise to the effector T and B cells? Well, largely, I think it's because of the technical challenge of looking at those populations. It's hard to do. And so we do have this bias in science, in my opinion, of always doing the thing that we know how to do and seeing the world through that lens of whatever that technology is. So what we do know is, a hypothesis is that part of what's driving this apparent poor durability of response and persistence apparently of memory cell populations that are effective, B and T, is that we've literally all been exposed to prior beta coronaviruses. So one of the things that was perplexing really early on in the outbreak was people were saying, including Rafi Ahmed, one of the leading B-cell immunologists in the world at Emory University, was noticing in his group that we were having a very rapid rise of neutralizing antibodies, which is really an artificial laboratory construct. So he was talking about this rapid rise of neutralizing antibodies, and lo and behold, they were being detected at about 14 days, sometimes even earlier. This is paradoxical. This is a memory response, not a primary response. Primary response timeline typically kick in at 21 to 28 days. Okay, so seeing it come up at 14 days means that what they were detecting as neutralizing antibodies was actually a recall to the prior beta coronavirus. And that leads you into this whole world of original antigenic sin, that the experience of having been infected by circulating cold beta coronaviruses, which have significant immunologic overlap, was biasing our immune responses to as if it was thinking that it was responding to a beta coronavirus instead of to the new pathogen. So that was one of the key things.
You compared it to a boxing match where you're always a little bit behind of...
Yeah, you're talking about the metaphor that I tried to use the other day. The next point, I think we have a bias of focusing on antibodies because looking at T cell populations is hard. It's hard to do it reproducibly. It takes expensive equipment. It's flow cytometry. It's advanced technology, and it's hard to do it at scale. And so it's very easy for us to just focus on this surrogate. But one of the things that's perplexed vaccinology historically is that we have a tendency, and the AIDS field really taught us this, to be totally biased that it's got to be this immune response category or that immune response. We want to have a T-cell AIDS vaccine or we want to have a B-cell AIDS vaccine, and it totally neglects that the natural immunity, the natural immune response that Gert is emphasizing is this complex phenomena that is multifactorial. And we tend to just look at one of those components rather than the whole landscape, and we tend to build vaccines to just elicit one of those types, whatever our cognitive bias is, that as vaccinologists we think, oh, it's antibodies that are most important, it's T cells that are most important, whatever, it's NK cells. We tend to focus on the antibody, and because it's the easy thing to detect. And the antibody signal is a very gross measure because it is typically a titer, a measure of the whole population, and only a tiny fraction of that is probably functional. I mean, the whole idea of the genetic vaccine was that it would elicit both a T and a B response, not just an antibody response. More traditional vaccines are more antibody-based. So that was the logic, but like I keep talking about you give a 3-year-old a hammer, everything's a nail. They keep thinking just about the antibody part. They're not focusing on this other. But let's say they are predominantly producing a somewhat ineffective neutralizing antibody response for the sake of argument. Well, the selective pressure then would drive the virus to spread from cell to cell instead because that escapes the antibody neutralization. And the only way to control the cell-to-cell spread is with effector T cells and some forms of antibody-dependent cellular cytotoxicity, et cetera. So this is not a difference this is not an argument with what Gert is saying, but rather a nuance that adds another layer to what he's pointing out is the selective pressure of vaccinating globally.
There is a competition between the antibodies that are binding to this receptor binding domain of the virus and the receptor on the cell that is also binding to this receptor binding domain of the virus. So the AC2 receptors and the antibodies are competing for the same receptor binding domain, because you have to imagine, if you have a number of mutations in this receptor binding domain that trigger resistance to the neutralizing antibodies, I mean, this is also very, very dynamic. And if you have in a very small domain a number of mutations, 10 non-synonymous mutations, you have to imagine that this fundamentally changes the physical-chemical properties of this receptor binding domain, such that it could even have a much higher affinity for the AC2 receptor, and thereby much more easily outcompete the antibodies. To what extent such a phenomenon could even lead, as Robert is saying, to an infection of new cells that doesn't even require an extracellular phase of the virus, so that the virus would first need to be released from the cell and then as a free virion infect a new cell, but that it could be really go from cell to cell without having that extracellular phase. These are things that are also unknown. So there is a number of phenomena that are changing at the same time, and you have always to think about, when you put this virus, a highly variable virus, under such massively immune pressure, it will find, you know, the variants that can accommodate for this, that can overcome this, and that may have, you know, it's very versatile. The plasticity of this virus to react to all this is just phenomenal. And that is what has been largely underestimated, the evolutionary capacity of this virus. I'm always saying we are probably compressing 200 years of evolution in just
2
like,
years,
yeah.
I agree with Gert. I resisted this language of natural immunity initially because it's too non-specific. It was appropriating some language that had been previously used to mean other things, like NK cells and the more primitive immune response that we all have. But it seems to have gotten embedded into the language of everybody, and the use of natural immunity seems to commonly be the immune response elicited by recovery from a viral infection, which is technically not correct, but it's in such widespread use now that's what everybody thinks about. So the thing about that compartment of those that have been infected, and that's a whole bunch of rabbit holes about what happens if you're infected, you recover, and then you get vaccinated, and the damage that the vaccine apparently can do to those that already have this natural immunity, right? But the thing about the immune response that's generated in the, I think it's appropriate to say, the natural environment. If we didn't manipulate our populations with these artificial pharmaceuticals, vaccines, okay, we would lose a fraction of our population, and because of our genetic diversity and blah, 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 a fraction of our population would survive this and develop an immune response, and that immune response isn't just against the spike, it's complex. It has all these different arms, all these different functional properties, and it's against a multitude of different proteins and fragments of protein subunits. Epitopes is the technical term, both for cellular immunity, T cell and antibody. So those that have this recovered natural immunity typically have a much broader immune profile, immune response profile, than those that have been subjected just to the spike vaccine that's actually mismatched and is to the Wuhan strain, right? And so I think this is key, and Gert has emphasized this, and he in some of his lectures he spoke about the importance of not vaccinating the pediatric population and reserving vaccine for those at greatest risk. And I talk about this having learned from his thinking and kind of trying to extend it a little bit, that then this goes back to the Great Barrington Declaration. Is the idea that we should be focusing this limited resource that is limited not only technically but also functionally by, as Gert says, if one continues to administer this into the teeth of an ongoing pandemic, you will lose its utility.
Yeah.
Will destroy it, and then it will put those at highest risk once again
Even
at higher risk, right? So it's madness in terms of evolutionary virology, but nonetheless we persist. So I find his logic that this intellectually immature practice, I think that's a very kind way to put it, of just blindly going about believing that we should implement a leaky vaccine in a universal fashion into the teeth, one with non-trivial adverse events. We could argue about those adverse events, but I think we can all agree that they're not nothing, right? It is not totally benign. Myocarditis is not nothing. Stroke is not nothing. And whether it's 1 in 1,000 or it's 1 in 10,000, it's still Russian roulette, right? So these aren't without any adverse events, and they are being wasted by overuse, like an antibiotic fed to cattle in a feedlot, right? It's the best everybody can understand that metaphor of developing superbugs, and I think this is one of the key insights of Gert that he's brought into play in this conversation.
What binds you is you already touched on this, is the vaccination of children. You both call it like a crime.
Yeah,
No, you said it was a crime.
Yeah, I think these are words that scientists are not using lightly.
Yeah.
But I don't have any other term, any other word for this, and I'm becoming really emotional when we talk about this. It is just, I have no words. I'm speechless.
It's unconscionable.
Yeah.
And what I find most paradoxical and most wrong, the cohort that's at high risk is predominantly the elderly. But this is the case with flu. This has always been the case with respiratory viruses. But the fear has been weaponized against the population through a variety of mechanisms by a variety of actors, state and non-state, to advance other agendas or advance economic agendas. Hard to discern what the agenda is, but absolutely we now have documentation that the fear has been weaponized, and the fear is in the elderly cohort, and the elderly cohort has been sold, it's been marketed to them, the logic that if we can only get these imperfect, leaky vaccines deployed universally all across the age range, then the elderly will be protected. And it's not the case. And that's the thing about Omicron, is it's making it so transparent that that's not the case. And I think that is the central angst that we and many of our colleagues share, is this sense of impending tragedy. And the metaphor of watching a slow motion train wreck. You're seeing it coming. You're saying, Gert has sent out these letters in which he's quite strident. He says, this is my last warning, right? You've said this a couple of times. Yeah. This is my last warning, world. Pay attention.
You send out a warning to the parents saying, be careful what you're doing. You're going to regret this.
It was basically, dear parents, these things can happen, and you have to own the responsibility. You cannot delegate the responsibility to the state. As parents, you have an obligation to inform yourself and to own the responsibility of what happens to your child. I really don't like to tell people what to do. I don't like to be told what to do. Most people don't like to be told what to do, at least adults. I don't even think children like to be told what to do. Realize that there could be consequences to your children. Those consequences can be in their central nervous system, their peripheral nervous system, their heart, their circulatory system, their immune system, and their reproductive system, just as a high level, right? and if damage to the heart and damage to the brain, scars.
What you say is take your responsibility and don't give it to the state, Don't let the state decide for you.
Yeah, own it.
Yeah.
because you're going to have to live with it.
Yeah.
That's the thing about indemnification.
Yeah.
Pfizer will not sell the vaccine to any nation state that doesn't provide it full and complete indemnification, which means that you cannot sue Pfizer
Yeah.
if you have an adverse event, if your child is damaged. Okay, and you can't sue the state, you can't sue Pfizer, and in many cases, in the United States at least, the insurance companies are backing off. A life insurance company is saying, no, we're not going to cover deaths due to vaccine, right? Because it was a known risk. When you accepted that vaccine, it was a known risk that you could die from it, and therefore it's not covered under your policy. Sorry, if you make a choice for your child to be vaccinated and they draw the short straw, or using the revolver metaphor, that is the bullet that was in that chamber, right? And your child became one of the 1 in 1,000, let's say, that are damaged, or maybe it's 1 in 3,000, we can argue. But you're going to have to live with that. You're going to have to bear the cost, and you're going to have to know in your mind for the rest of your natural life that you allowed your child to take that risk and incur that damage.
Yeah.
It is true that children can, of course, get the disease, and I think the more infectious the dominant variant is, the higher the likelihood that they may get disease. But there is very, very little chance that they will get severe disease. And we should not forget, we should not be afraid of getting disease, right? Or being for a couple of days in bed. When we cure this out, we acquire a very functional, even long-lived, most likely immunity. There is definitely a risk for adverse events, that is very clear. And we know that children are very well protected. I mean, there are publications that highlight this by their innate antibodies, by their innate immunity. And we know that this innate immunity can be trained, but we also know that this innate immunity contributes to a large extent to eliminating the virus. People who develop asymptomatic mild infection will eliminate
in the population, not only in themselves.
Exactly, and we are eliminating a reservoir that I call the vacuum cleaners of the pandemic, and which are basically the unvaccinated, particularly the younger part of the population. And by doing massive vaccination of the children, we are going to take away our last chance, in fact, to generate this herd immunity. So this is exactly the opposite from what these experts and public health authorities are trying to make us believe, that by vaccinating children, we would protect older age groups. I mean, first of all, how many times do we need to repeat that these vaccines cannot block transmission? That is one thing. And the second thing is that instead of having an impact on transmission, we are just going to do the opposite, because by vaccinating the children, we will prevent them from really eliminating the virus. So it's not just the impact on the individual health of the children, which is of course critical, but it's also the impact that this has at the public health level. So these innate antibodies, this is not speculation, this is known, they have a critical role in eliminating the cell-fly components so that autoimmune diseases would not develop.
Sure.
If it is really true, which I think is the case, that the vaccinal antibodies may to some extent suppress these innate antibodies, then what we're saying is that we are suppressing functional capacity also in children to prevent autoimmune diseases.
Bingo. Which is why it is so critical in our discipline. Historically, one will follow, after you complete the large clinical trial, the phase 3 trial, you typically follow that for a couple of years, if not 3. Yeah. And the reason is because these autoimmune phenomena are delayed. Yeah. And you don't pick it up after 2 weeks, you pick it up after 2 years. There's another thing I'd like to say, getting back to the children, is that children's immune systems are different from adults. In fact, what we have is a progression as we age of gradually developing immunosenescence. It's a big fancy word that says that our immune system ages with the rest of our body. And there's multiple factors that go into that, but the one that really separates children from adults is their thymus. This you can think of it as the school, the university for their T cells. We don't really understand how the thymus works to educate T cells, but we do know that children have a much more robust thymus. It's much larger, it's much more capable, it's much more dynamically learning about its environment and how to process antigens and respond to pathogens, just like their brains are changing and evolving and adapting to the environment in a very dynamic way. So too is their immune system. And so what is clear is that with many viral pathogens, measles is an example, if adults are infected for the first time, they often have much more pathology. And this is a novel virus that's entered into all age cohorts in the human race right now. Often, it's the case that because children have this much more dynamic, capable immune response, particularly in terms of T response because of their thymus, they're able to process pathogen antigens and respond much more efficiently and effectively. And we see this in the case of this particular pathogen than do adults. Now, the normal course of events is that a new pathogen will sweep through a population, a new species like us, and you will have this pathology. Often the youth will be more resistant to the pathology. And then there exists this dynamic equilibrium that we gradually approximate, which we call herd immunity, right? And then what happens is the pathogen is no longer circulating in the population. And we have birth cohorts come into the population that have not seen the pathogen over time. And they develop to a certain level at which the pathogen, whether it's in an animal reservoir, it's hidden in some human population, comes in, and you can actually watch viruses circle the globe in pediatric cohorts as those cohorts get large enough that they can sustain an R naught that's greater than 1, so that there's enough that they can infect. And so it's the natural course of the human species as an integrated range of ages that it'll take a hit from this initial incursion of a pathogen as it reaches its equilibrium. And then over time, the pathogen will still circulate, but it'll circulate in this youth population, this young population that is immunologically naive to that pathogen because they haven't encountered it before, but they have much better immune systems, and so they handle that. Chickenpox is another example, and so we have this naive idea that we can come up with a better human. I mean, that's kind of what we're talking about, that we know enough about immunology and virology that we can modify the natural human immune response and largely disregard this evolved, amazing capability, whether it's evolved or it's God-given, depending on how you want to look at it, or some mix of the two. Nevertheless, it's amazingly complex. We are still babes in the woods in terms of understanding that complexity and all these dynamics that Gerd is talking about, and it is grossly naive, and frankly, it's hubris to believe that we have such a sophisticated understanding of virology and immunology and viral evolution that we can predict and administer something like this into this whole population and mitigate the natural process and come up with something that's better than what has naturally evolved over millennia and millennia. And that is one of my other fundamental objections as a vaccinologist, right? Is for us, we live in this world, we know all this nuance, it's hard even to describe the nuance. It's so much depth and interaction of all these variables. And yet I think that any of us that are true scientists have to come to terms with the fact that even though we know so much, we actually know so little. And we have to be humble in interventions with our patients in the human population. And this is why it's so important to do things in a slow, stepwise, gradual manner to ensure safety, because the system is so complex.
So we cannot have any other conclusion that this is just a huge experiment on human beings, and including, of course, the children, which is even, sad because they are such a vulnerable population.
I'm left with little to add, but to remind our viewers of the logic that was shared during one of the key advisory groups as they were looking for the FDA, as they were looking at the childhood vaccine strategy. And the logic that was put out by a member of this key committee, VRBAC is the acronym, by the person who is the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine. His statement was, we don't understand how well these vaccines will work in children until we just start vaccinating them.
Wow.
That in my mind, from a bioethical standpoint, as someone who does clinical research, that is an obscene statement. I mean, that we have all this learning and experience and training and protocol and practice that says that you move very carefully, particularly into pediatric cohorts. And the logical thing that one would do would be to test these vaccines in the highest risk children, the diabetic children, the morbidly obese children, the ones that are at high risk, and ascertain that they're safe and effective in those cohorts, and then gradually broaden them. So a gradual stepwise, rather than this very crude logic of, well, let's just go try it. I mean, this is,
on children.
I can't, as a bench researcher when I was working with mice, okay, if I said to the animal use committee for my university, well, I'm not sure what's going to happen, so I'm just going to try it on these 300 mice, okay? They would say, no, you're not, okay? You're going to justify how many mice exactly and what your proposal is and what are the endpoints that you're trying to do. They wouldn't allow me to do that on mice, let alone on children. I'm asked, why do you object so stridently? The answer is because I'm seeing my profession destroyed. The norms of my profession, both as a physician and as a vaccinologist, the norms that we've developed over decades to ensure safety, ensure that we don't destroy our legitimacy as a discipline in the public's eye, have just been grossly disregarded. And that's what I object to most, is the norms of bioethics and the norms of clinical research and staged responsible research have been completely disregarded. And the most charitable way I can rationalize that is that people are driven crazy with fear.
The preservation of our freedom is everyone's concern. The understanding and the knowing we can burn. The knowledge we have gathered over toil and snare could bring us to a higher ground if only we would dare to love, dare to understand, dare to care, dare to love a man.
In the next episode, Jacobin Hausman and Alain Grutars have a roundtable discussion with Dr. Robert Malone and Dr. Geert Vanden Bossche. They are joined by our special guest, Dr. Matthias Desmet, clinical psychologist and specialist on mass formation psychosis.
This metaphor of headwinds, I keep coming back, is really a ship metaphor, right? That we're sailing against the wind. Hopefully we don't get blown onto the rocks.
But the thing is, we don't have the impression at all to be sailing against wind, right? Because we are sailing, in the right direction.
Round here and over there, we could
And we have to stop considering human beings as economic units or mechanized components of a mechanized system. I think that is intrinsically depersonalizing, and I think it destroys human dignity.
I can tell you when I was working with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they were queuing up, to come into the room where I was presenting the kind of projects we were interested in, and etc. You were the king, and now the very same guys, they look at you at a piece of dirt, let's say.
Hannah Arendt mentioned that already in 1953. She said, we will see the emergence of a new totalitarian system, but it will no longer be led by gang leaders such as Stalin and Hitler. It will be led by dull bureaucrats and technocrats.
Please support our independent journalism and go to headwind.tv.